Welcome to Game Design Hour, the podcast where I interview the people behind the video games you love. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Dylan Gedig about his work on the video game Peglin. Let's get into the interview. What sparked your interest in creating video games?
Originally, I wanted to be a writer, and I took a swing at that for a little bit, but it just doesn't have as much interactivity between the author and the consumer or the reader, I guess. And, in games, there's so much back and forth between like players and the creators. And so as soon as I started dabbling in little like interactive things, it just kind of went from there.
After deciding that you wanted to make video games, how did you first learn how to create them?
I just found a book on how to make games with C++, because, that's what I thought you had to know to make video games, and just went from there. It was just a bunch of little text adventures at first, and then I kind of got started writing my own game engine, which kind of took 2 years of my life that probably could have been spent making games had I sucked it up and just used something like GameMaker or Unity. And then I started using GameMaker or Unity, and that allowed me to actually release games that, didn't take 5 years to make.
Did you ever finish with making your own game engine?
It worked. It was playable. With engines, you're never really finished. That's why there's always teams of engineers like releasing updates every year. But yeah, it was playable, and it ran on Windows and Android. And that was what kind of killed it for me, was that seeing the amount of time each update would take to work across both platforms for, any feature I wanted to add in one of my games. That was when I kind of decided that I would rather be making games than making game engines. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just, there's different tastes for different people.
After deciding to move away from that game engine, how did you first get into the video game industry?
I was going through university at the time, and the university that I went to had a really good co-op program. So kind of like an internship. And that was how I first took my first steps. Kind of had they called it a content creator role, but you're kind of like a game designer / writer, and just creating a bunch of new story for a little like online RPG, which was pretty neat.
What was the online RPG that you were working on?
It was called Bushwhacker 2. It was kind of like if you took a Legend of Zelda game and made it free to play. It was kind of an interesting thing to work on.
How did you first think of the idea for Peglin?
It originated at a game jam, which is where you sit down and just make a game over the course of 48 hours. And I knew going in that I wanted to just do something fun and physicsy, just either something bouncing around, something getting knocked over, something along those lines. And I was kind of leaning towards Brick Breaker. And then the theme of the jam was fall. And so I figured, it probably meant the season because it was in autumn, but I still wanted to do my physicsy thing. So I just decided to flip it on its head. And I had kind of this brick breakery thing, but with the ball bouncing down. And from there, making the pegs round instead of square was just kind of natural because square things don't bounce very fun.
What game jam was it?
It was one that was local to Victoria, British Columbia, which is where I was living at the time. And it was called Orca Jam. After
the game jam, what was the first step you took to putting it out in the world and making it what it is now?
Great question. So at the end of the game jam, we had a playable version, and it's actually just still up on itch.io and can be played, which is pretty cool. And we kind of shelved it for a little while just because, we'd finished what we set out to make, and that was about it. Had other side projects on the go at the time. So we kind of just let it sit there. But our friends and family kept going back to it and would play around every now and then and be like, are you ever going to make more content for this? Are there going to be more levels? This is pretty fun. And eventually we just got kind of persuaded to, take that on as the main side project. And when the pandemic really started to set in, around March 2020, that was when I was like, okay, if nothing else good comes of this, I'm going to just use the quarantine, the extra time to burrow my head and come out of this with a game on the other end. And that's when we decided to make it an actual released game instead of just a little prototype.
The game feels like it draws inspiration from a lot of other RPGs and tabletop RPGs. I'm very familiar with D&D. What were some of the biggest inspirations behind Peglin?
There's a lot of little references and a hodgepodge of inspirations drawn there. The two biggest ones are Peggle and Slay the Spire. Once we had that bouncing mechanic of the ball is falling, hitting round pegs, you kind of want to look to the mainstay in the industry. So yeah, that they'd solved a lot of design problems already that we were able to take inspiration from, which was really nice. Things like the crit peg, that acts pretty similar to the bonus peg in Peggle. And Slay the Spire was another huge one. It just gave us a structure that we could build the game around. It's just nice to kind of have this good wrapper for it. Originally, we were planning on having it be an RPG, just like a full-on play through this 8 to 10 hour short kind of JRPG experience. And we're running into, how the heck do you balance this thing? We want to give the player these big crazy powers that completely destroy the physics system and let you get 10,000 damage. But if you do that 4 hours into a 10-hour RPG, nobody's really having fun there. So that's when we kind of looked to roguelikes for inspiration, because that allowed us to kind of, hit the reset button and have way crazier powers instead of trying to sand the edges off of all of those. So those are the two biggest ones. But yeah, it's very much fantasy inspired. You play as a little goblin, you're fighting against slimes. So taking inspiration from just a lot of those games over the years.
Were there any interesting ideas that you had in the game at one point that just ended up getting cut?
That's a good question. I don't think so. It's been pretty iterative development. The RPG system probably would have brought some more stuff along with it that didn't really make it into the game. We used to have some stat progressions, you would get more strength that would make you permanently stronger. So that didn't quite get removed, but it did get repurposed in the form of temporary buffs and relics that put up your strength. So that kind of just got transformed instead of removed. And, we're still, I think our next game, because this one leaves a lot to be desired for people that just want to see increases and get those crazy big numbers and have those things. So there a future version of Peglin, not the same game, a sequel or something, might return to those kind of RPG roots. So yeah, nothing that didn't really make the cut other than that genre change, but we might still return to that as well.
Something that is very common among many RPGs and is seen in this game is boss fights. Can you tell me a bit about how you work to make the boss fights feel different than the regular fights?
Yeah. So we try to have each boss fight have some kind of particular gimmick. And some of the things in the ones in the game currently will probably see another pass just to make them a bit more unique at some point. The slime boss is definitely the one that we're kind of proudest of. There's so many times where I've been watching a YouTuber or a streamer play the game, and as soon as they get gobbled up, there's just this little delight. They're just completely unexpected, and the pegboard reflects it where now you're shooting from inside the slime. So that one we're pretty proud of. But other than that, it's just, a lot of throwing ideas at the wall. You kind of have to approach it from a thematic standpoint of what would you find in this particular area? What could make a boss? And does it fit the story? And then mechanics all have to work and be interesting. And, they can be tougher for certain builds, but shouldn't be impossible for any of them. So you've kind of got that mechanic standpoint. And then just, how they relate to all of the other content, which I guess kind of fits into the theme.
Managing scope is a very big part of game design. How did you work to manage the scope of this game while you were working on it?
Oh, not very well, I'll tell you that much. The original plan for Peglin was supposed to take about 6 months from beginning to Steam release. But as the demo picked up traction and started getting more and more players, we started focusing a lot more on polish and quality of life features instead of the content. The content was nice enough that we always planned on having 3 areas, 3 bosses per area. That was all just nicely defined. But we kind of got away from ourselves on the quality and game feel. And that was just a direct result of having so many players trying the demo and providing their feedback. So it really would not be the same game without all of our community, which is really, really cool. But other than that, the scope hasn't been too crazy. There's a few things that are still kind of unbounded. Like, we don't know how many orbs or relics we're going to have. Like, those will just be constant additions until, the game is done. So there's a few things that, maybe not the best planning, but it's made for a very fun, iterative design experience, and kind of allows us to be a bit more reactive as well. If certain strategies are lacking or if certain strategies are overpowered, we can kind of introduce new content to address that instead of having to make direct changes. Although obviously we also do that for balancing reasons as well.
Fixing bugs is another big part of game design. Was there any strange or interesting bugs that you came across while working on Peglin?
There's been a lot, for sure. One of the interesting things about making a roguelike like this is every piece of content that you add interacts with everything else that's already in the game. So it's impossible for us to fully test everything before we put it in players' hands, which is one of the big reasons that we've gone to early access. I'm pretty proud of how stable the game has been relatively, but there have been some really crazy ones, like physics interactions causing things to just rocket out of the pegboard when that should be physically impossible. There was definitely a funny one where when we first introduced our upgraded aimer, which actually simulates where your shot will go, it would have interactions on the main pegboard still. So we have a lightning orb that does chain lightning to nearby pegs. And the simulated orb was chain lightninging to the main pegboard. So anytime you would aim over a peg, it would zap it and all nearby pegs, and you could just clear a board by waving at it. That was a pretty funny one.
Earlier, you talked about making it a roguelike so that players couldn't get too overpowered. Are you able to tell me a bit more about that decision to make it a roguelike style game?
Definitely. Yeah. So the reason that we made it a roguelike was actually so that players could become super overpowered. Because, if you have this RPG and then if you can just one shot everything, that is not particularly interesting. And that's a lot harder to design around. And we've been working on the game, I've been putting little thoughts into that of how would you balance that? What kind of mana systems could we use to limit how much power a player can exert at any given time, while still giving them the crazy full magnet effect that we used to have in the game that players were sad when I pulled it out. But yeah, the problem with that in particular is every single shot that players took would take 3 or 4 minutes. And in a roguelike where you can't disable a relic, that gets old extremely quickly. That just doesn't work very well. So yeah, the decision to make the game a roguelike instead of something like a puzzle quest RPG fully came from just I want to enable crazy broken combinations. And how do I do that while keeping the game interesting? And the other bonus as well is that there's so many combinations of content that if it was an RPG and you were just building out a skill web or something, replaying that to then see some other builds, would take 8 hours unless you're just restarting the game halfway through or whatever. Whereas in a roguelike, we're trying to keep our runs below an hour and a half, somewhere between an hour and an hour and a half is our ideal run time. So then if you die early or you have a successful run, now you get to try something else almost right away. And, we're still at the point now where there's still only 3 viable builds, but the more content that we add, we're kind of taking a very close eye to upcoming synergies. We would really like to just have an immense amount of just half of these 2 builds play together really nicely. And I think I've created something new that I haven't seen before. That is kind of the heart of where we would like Peglin to be. Just I've combined these things and I am an unstoppable juggernaut for the last 4 fights of the run. That's the perfect outcome for us.
By build, you're talking about the combination of orbs and relics that a player might make, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I guess that's kind of roguelike deck builder terminology specifically. But yeah, anything that a player is obtaining into, you can call it a loadout as well. Anything that they're kind of collecting to create their own unique build or unique strategy, all of the contents of like their deck or their orbs and then their relics and how those all play together.
How large was the team that created Peglin?
The original game jam started with 2 people, and then we worked on it part-time for a little while and added another part-time developer to help out with a lot of the nitty-gritty stuff, and a composer to the team, so we'd have the fresh beats. And then up until the early access release, so the team was just those 4 people, but we've been able to hire a community manager now, and most of us have gone to work on the game full time, which is really cool.
What parts of the game did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
Definitely the balancing right before release. You know, we had the demo available for so long that we had started balancing content too specifically for it. And the demo was the first full third of the game. So we had really like designed it out, or it had ended up kind of growing this way that by the end of the demo, you kind of had a complete build, or all of your orbs were powered up. You were really seeing like, you know, a full power experience of the game, which worked okay for the demo for sure. But as we expanded that content out, we kind of needed to like squash that power curve so that you're growing into that, you know, over the course of an hour instead of over the course of 20 minutes. So that was definitely like a bit of a rough part of development, because we had already kind of picked up so many players by then that the demo had something like 60,000 active players. And, you know, a lot of people were very unhappy about like seeing all of this content get nerfed. So that definitely like that took a lot of time of just like, you know, I played through the game probably 100 times every week, just like ironing out the edges, making sure it felt the way that it was supposed to. And then kind of the second part of that would be our crucible system, which is our like difficulty ladder. And that as well, you know, I just kind of had to play each difficulty like a couple of times just to make sure that it felt where it should. So those definitely take some time. Yeah, we do have a speed up feature in development now and coming to players soon. So that is going to make testing these things so much better, which is nice.
What was your process for playtesting, and what things from playtesting on this game will you take with you onto your next game?
The biggest thing for us has just been like having the community the entire time. You know, they kind of, our friends and family were our playtesters for the initial prototype, but from there, like it started to spread a little bit. Like just already we had a little bit of word of mouth just from people being like, hey, check this prototype out. It takes 5 minutes to play. And so as soon as we had playable builds of like what is actually now Peglin, that already had its own little audience. And that just helped us out a ton when it came to like prioritizing features. Like what are the things that are bothering players that might not necessarily bother us? You know, just some huge quality of life features that we just would have kept kicking down the road for a while, that players were just kind of telling us repeatedly, like, you know, we could use this now. Like this would be very, very helpful. For a very long time, you couldn't view your map again when you were in battle. Like it was just like, you know, a fairly big system. When you're working on a fresh game, you'd rather be working on content and all this new stuff. But that was one that we heard like over and over again. So that, you know, was we put into the game. And it was a huge addition. Like it was absolutely necessary. It made our lives a lot easier testing. But it's just not something you like really think is 100% necessary until it's in players' hands. And the speed up feature is similar to that too. It's like, yeah, it makes our lives a lot better. The game is playable without it. You know, it's tough to make that call of like, where is your time more valuable right now, working on this system or working on more content, more bosses, more orbs, more relics. But when you hear that feedback repeatedly, you know that like, okay, it's time to roll this out and make some time for this.
Do you think that for newer game devs, you would recommend putting out a demo and getting player feedback as opposed to more closed testing and it's not fully open to the public?
It really depends. It depends a lot on the type of game and on the developer themselves. So I think for the biggest point of that would be like, make sure you're testing in some capacity. Like you kind of mentioned closed testing is like, that's A-okay. Like I said, you know, it started with friends and family. The game, it was rough, you know, it was made in the weekend. So it wasn't like any big polished fun experience, but it had the root of the idea. You could see how it worked there. So that friends and family feedback originally was super, super important. And, you know, I have something like 13 or 14 games up on itch that anyone can go and play. And most of them are just like fun little jam experiences that just, would never make a full game. But testing that really helps you identify which are which. Like I find, once you've completed something, there's this like honeymoon period of like, this game is the greatest game in the world. I'm going to make it a full game, throw it on Steam. It's going to be excellent. I'm going to win IGF awards. It's going to be fantastic. And until you actually put that game in front of people, you won't really know. Like with Peglin, there was like that clear demand of like, I would like more levels for this. Like the game as it stands, like just it needs more. And that is a very good sign. Whereas, with some of our other games, our friends and family will be like, that was great. I had a lot of fun. That was good. And you kind of have to learn to parse that feedback out. And then I mentioned that, it depends a lot on the developer as well. So if you are a developer or designer in this case that can like take feedback very well, and I think it's an important skill for all designers to work on because it's never fully easy, but it's so important. Then you definitely want to open that up to wider people because the internet is not going to like honeycoat anything for you. It's going to be like, here is my direct, honest feedback, very, very blunt. And you need to be able to take that feedback without having it impact like your motivation to work on the game. So that's very, very designer dependent as well. And, there are ways around that. Like if you are an excellent game designer without receiving feedback and you can just like create this big, concise thing, I think it's still important to have that kind of open process. You just might need to find some other structures in place to like make that work, whether you're working through a publisher or have the ability to work with a CM, a community manager, whether volunteer like the rest of the team, revenue share, like however you can do it. There are definitely ways to work around that. And then the game type is also, it's like the last core piece. For us, like Peglin was really made to be like replayable. Like from the core, it's just like, I just wanted to bounce balls around and watch numbers go bigger like that, and that's always fun. Like you just do it again and again. And like, that's great. Everything that we've kind of added on top for all the roguelike systems have just been kind of like the butter on top. So for us, getting players in super early, going into early access, having the open demo, that's all made a ton of sense for those open feedback. If your game is like a linear puzzle platformer that takes like 4 hours to beat, that's going to be a lot harder to kind of get that recurring feedback from players because once they beat it, most of them are going to be done.
What was your process for designing and balancing the different orbs in the game?
Ongoing, I would say. It's very much like we throw a lot of stuff at the wall and we kind of see where it lands. We do often try to create specific synergies, and the content in certain points almost kind of designs itself. Once you have things that interact with this particular system, now that makes a lot of sense for it to either work in reverse and create like a mirror orb to it, or to like create another orb to work specifically with it. But a lot of our content has kind of come about just by accident of like, what would happen if we were to do this? And that has been pretty fun being able to design in that way. And then we're also in the future kind of planning like, we have these 3 classes designed out, but we don't have all of their content for them yet. But we know that like these are the roles that we want them to fill. And so we'll be sitting down specifically to like, how do we design something that matches this particular like flavor for the world? So kind of, approaching it from those 2 different directions of like purely mechanically, and then we'll work out all the style stuff on top of it, versus coming from the style first and we'll find a mechanical match and everything kind of has to meet and marry in the middle there.
Were there any fun little details that you have added into the game that you think that most players might miss?
Some of the puns are like extremely obscure. There's definitely a few that are like just kind of in there for me, little references and jokes. We didn't expect the game to be as big as it was. And then by the time it was like, oh, yeah, I guess that's what that's called now. I think the biggest, like the one that least people would know is the town that I was based in when I started the game, Victoria. Is kind of known for like a cocktail called a shaft. It's an alcoholic coffee drink. And so we have the light shaft potion and the heavy shaft potion. And that kind of like started as a reference to that. And, it's kind of like a dumb little joke on its own. You've got light shafts and then, well, what about heavy shafts? But that was kind of rooted in that.
What was it like working on this video game during the pandemic?
It was really good. It really started as a pandemic passion project. That was when we decided to really buckle down and let's just make something that we release so that 5 years from now, when all this is behind us, we have something good to show that came out of it, as well as, keep us busy so that we don't get cabin fever or go a little crazy. So yeah, that was a big part of it. And then an unexpected benefit was, because a community really grew around it, it turned what could have been an extraordinarily isolating time into just this really fun, lighthearted, almost like a party, right? Our community is just, it's full of sweethearts. Everyone is so nice and supportive. And that just really bolstered us through it. Anytime motivation would run a little low on working on the game, you just have to open up our Discord and just see all the nice messages and content suggestions and all the people just engaging with the game and bonding over that. Yeah, it has been phenomenal for sure.
What was the biggest design challenge you faced while working on Peglin?
It's definitely ongoing balance. We have to be really careful now with the amount of players that we have for releasing content that is just so powerful that it makes the game trivial, or make shots last several minutes, which is very, very fun the first few times you see it. But then, of course, it just hampers the replayability of the game, right? It's I got started into taking this thing again. This run's going to take 2 hours now. So balancing has definitely been the trickiest part, especially just with the sheer amount of content. And that'll be an ongoing concern for us. But, that's the big reason that we're in early access. We're hoping that, players have fun with some of the crazy imbalances as we kind of work towards getting something that's more stable and has more available synergies, instead of there being one winning build or win condition that you always try to aim for. So that's definitely the trickiest. Yeah, everything else, I kind of said, it almost designs itself, especially once you have a bunch of players out there and everything. We can kind of target oh, this build is overpowered. We can either nerf this build, or we still have a few bosses remaining. What can the next boss do to be a little resistant to that? So players will have to, expand their repertoire and not use the same thing every time.
Looking back now, what do you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch of the game?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I think ideally, we would have had more money in the bank and been able to wait a little while for our early access release. We kind of were frantically still balancing content up until the day of release. And so the build that streamers were playing was very, very swingy, depending on the day that they were playing it, because things were changing so rapidly. And streamers really showed up for us. The game would not be anywhere near as successful as it is without all of the support of the incredible roguelike streaming and YouTuber community. The ecosystem that they have between devs and the streamers is just so cool, and it's so awesome to be a part of it. So that would probably be the biggest thing that I would choose. But once you set your release date in, there's not much more you can do other than work as hard as you can, bust your butt to get something stable out the door. And we did okay. The release went well. It was there wasn't a lot of fires to fight after that. So I don't have very many regrets, but that would probably be one of the bigger ones, I would say.
What was the biggest lesson that you learned from working on Peglin?
The biggest one would be I don't know if I can ever make a game that isn't roguelike again. I would like to try, but when you're a small team, not having to focus so hard on marketing and instead being able to focus on making the game better really, really helps. And because of that roguelike ecosystem, the marketing that they were essentially doing for us or helping us do was 1,000 times more potent than anything that I could do. And so many solo devs are sitting there just trying to get their game in front of people that, any time that they spend putting together a new trailer and putting that on Reddit and trying to share on Twitter and all of these different things that for us just had no impact at all. That's all time that you could spend working on the game. And after a while, I finally just fully embraced that and was no amount of like marketing on our end is going to be as impactful as like making the next update the best that we possibly can, so that the streamers come back to the game and play it again. And, they just have these massive, super engaged audiences. Like I said, our community is just full of sweethearts. Like, it is just such an awesome part of the games industry to be in. So, I'm just making roguelikes for the rest of my life is what I learned there.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to get their first game made?
The biggest thing, like the number one thing, would be just like ship games. Like, I don't care if you want to like be an engine developer, or if you want to, work as just a 3D modeler and not be a generalist. Like, I come at it from the indie side, where it's like we're all kind of indie generalists. So like, we just want to ship as many games as we can. But regardless of where you're working in the industry, like, the motivation increase that you get from like having something playable that you can just like hop back on and like reminisce, and the portfolio impact of like going to an employer and being like, these are the games that I have made and finished, whether solo or with a team. Game jams are an excellent opportunity to just like get a bunch of games under your belt. Yeah, my biggest piece of advice is just like, learn how to finish and share your games. And you get to go through the whole process of like receiving feedback and iterating on it. There's just so much important stuff that you'll never get if you're only getting to the stage where like you have prototypes littering your desktop. Which is, it's also good. It's an important part of creating just for yourself. But for games specifically, and how entwined developers are with their creators in this day and age, finishing games and getting them online for people to play it's so immensely important. I find it hard to like understate how important it is. Overstate? Some kind of state.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
Oh, Peglin forever. Yeah, we have so much, so much to do before we can even start moving off. I do have a few designs that are starting to cook in my brain that hopefully I'll be able to prototype over the course of a couple of game jams in the coming year. A couple of ideas about what we might do next. But in the near, for the next year, it's going to be just Peglin content, Peglin systems. The launch has been just so incredible, so much more, so much higher than we ever thought the game could go. So we definitely feel like we owe it to our community, and we owe it to, the streamers and YouTubers that have given us so much, to just keep on giving them more of the best content that we have until the game is, at a point where we can call it 1.0.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been great interviewing you.
Yeah, thank you, Miles. It's a lot of fun.
And that's how the interview went down. I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to follow, subscribe. It's different on every platform. Also, consider giving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. If you think a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them. And once again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time. Bye.